He loved rituals as a person. He loved the idea of all the different kinds of rituals that humanity had created, rituals that were religious and spiritual rituals, but we have rituals in every part of our lives, sports rituals, political rituals, education rituals, getting up in the morning rituals. So, they're these repetitive and rhythmic behaviors and practices that we do to connect us, to help us feel grounded, to connect us to who we are, maybe to connect us to a group of people. But he took this from an evolutionary perspective, which was that, well, if we have rituals, if human beings have rituals, where did they come from? Arguably speaking, if you take an evolutionary perspective on that, human rituals must have come from animal rituals. And so he started to look very deeply at animal rituals. But interestingly, animal rituals are all mating rituals. So that was where we first started thinking about the sexuality piece.
I'm Jeffrey Colon. This is Talk by Turner. Talk by Turner dives deep into the intellectual discovery while examining what's happening in our world right here, right now. Join us each week to hear from published authors and industry experts as they share their knowledge and insight. Now let's check out who's on this week's episode. Andrew Newberg, welcome to Talk by Turner.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the program.
So the title of your book, Sex, God, and the Brain, it's quite an attention grabber when you think about it. Did you have any apprehensions about the reception of your book, particularly from, let's say, more conservative religious communities?
I guess I always have a little bit of apprehension. A lot of my work does look at the intersection between science and religion, and what's going on in the brain and how that relates to our experience of the spiritual, of God. I try to be very cautious in what I talk about and how I talk about things. And so whether I'm naive or have done a reasonably decent job, usually I think people receive the information well. I think people kind of take from it what is valuable to them, which I think is always kind of an important for any piece of scholarship or information, which is that people kind of understand it and utilize it in ways that can be helpful for them. And I always try to caution people about being kind of, overindulgent, so to speak, in exactly how they wind up using this information one way or the other. To start off with, one of my favorite little brief stories was that when we did an initial study of a group of Franciscan nuns in prayer, and I did the brain scan and showed her, the first nun, the brain scan, she said, this is so fantastic, Dr. Newberg, thank you for showing me that when I pray, things are really changing in my brain and my body. It really helps me to sort of support the what I do and why I'm religious. And I said, you're welcome. And off she went. She was very happy. And then after we published the data, I got a call from the head of the local atheist society, and they said, Dr. Newberg, I just wanted to thank you for this research because it proves conclusively that there is no God and it's just a manifestation of your brain. And I said, you're welcome. Off he went, and he was very happy. So, the same piece of data made a nun and an atheist happy at the same time. And I guess there's some universal yin and yang going on there. But again, coming back to your question, I think any time that I put out information and data on this kind of relationship between our brain and our spirituality, there's always the opportunity for people to take it the wrong way. I obviously always hope that people take it the right way and help us to understand who we are as human beings and how all the things that we do affect us, and hopefully use this information in ways that can be beneficial for people, both in terms of understanding their spirituality, however they define that, as well as their mind and their consciousness and how we define that. So there's so much that I think we can all learn from this kind of information.
What was the most surprising fact that you discovered when you were doing your research for Sex, God, and the Brain?
Well, I think, one of the exciting elements of it, and we had always kind of, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more detail, but in my last 30 years of work looking at this relationship between the brain and spirituality, I always knew that there was some connection between sexuality and spirituality. So that was always kind of in the back and trying to think about this. But it was really the opportunity to do some brain scan studies of a spiritual practice that utilizes sexual stimulation that I had never had the opportunity to do before. And so that to me was kind of the real exciting new element here, which was to be able to look at sexuality, sexual stimulation, spirituality, spiritual stimulation, and how they're related to each other. And that to me was the most exciting part, at least one of the most exciting parts of this research, was to have some empirical data, to actually have some research data and some brain scans to help us understand what that relationship was and the complexity of that relationship. And that to me is always what is one of the big take-home messages of all of my work, which is that there's not just one little part of our brain that turns on when we're spiritual. There's many different parts of our brain, and that was true for this practice that looks at this relationship between sexuality and spirituality as well.
So you've talked about your interest from an early age, in why people believe in what they believe, why it can differ so extremely across religions and cultures. So, how has your understanding of this question changed as you've gotten older and you've pursued your career studying neuroscience and medicine?
Well, I think it's always been kind of an evolving process. In any good research and scholarship, we always learn new things. Every time I do a brain scan, I don't want to say every time, but many times when we do a new brain scan study, there's this area of the brain that we hadn't thought about before, and that seems to be involved in this process. So that to me was always kind of an exciting piece to watch the development and the evolution of some of the early work, some of the early kind of models that we developed about what's going on in the brain during spiritual experiences, to see the basic elements seem to still hold, but that we kind of created a much more robust and complex approach to understanding this. And I guess maybe that's part of the answer to your question too, which is that the complexity of the brain just never ceases to amaze me. It's every time you think you have something kind of nailed down, there's some other aspect of it. We start, nowadays we talk a lot in terms of brain networks and how all the different parts of the brain are interconnected with each other. I talked about that many years ago before we actually formally talked about the concept of networks, but we looked at all these different complex areas of the brain. And so, that continues to evolve. And as you mentioned, a lot of this has really been a lifelong pursuit for me, and continues to be. It is a kind of a combined scientific and spiritual path, so to speak, where I love looking into the scientific aspects of it. I love doing the science of studying different kinds of practices and experiences that people have had. I do a lot of personal reflection and self-contemplation as well. So I'm always trying to kind of think about how I can understand in my own mind the ideas and the concepts that we're looking at. And ultimately, there's sort of these big questions about the nature of reality, as you mentioned, why people believe what they believe, whether what we believe is accurate, how we determine whether it's accurate, where do all of our experiences, especially some of these incredible mystical experiences, what they have to say about this whole thing. So it continues to sort of enrich and develop. I don't know if I've had any, true sort of shift in the way I've been thinking, but it just kind of continues to evolve. And I think, and maybe one of the main take-home messages that I always try to tell people, and certainly something that I've learned over time, is just a real appreciation for everyone's experiences and everyone's beliefs. That if you're genuine and honest about the beliefs that you hold, then I think that's very powerful to understand that all of us come to different ideas and different beliefs about the world around us, and maybe it's not such a surprise given the uniqueness of our genes and our brain and all of the experiences that we've had.
So something you talk about in the book is the role sexual selection plays in human evolution. I'd love you to dive more into this. So how has human mating rituals and sexual decision-making, how does that impact our species as a whole?
Well, this actually does go back to kind of the origin of the book. So I had a wonderful mentor and colleague, a fellow by the name of Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist, but also had a PhD in anthropology. And a lot of his early work, this goes back to the 1970s, was looking at the relationship between rituals and the brain. He loved rituals as a person. He loved the idea of all the different kinds of rituals that humanity had created, rituals that were religious and spiritual rituals, but we have rituals in every part of our lives, sports rituals, political rituals, education rituals, getting up in the morning rituals. They're sort of they're these repetitive and rhythmic behaviors and practices that we do to connect us, to help us feel grounded, to connect us to who we are, maybe to connect us to a group of people. But he took this from an evolutionary perspective, which was that, well, if we have rituals, if human beings have rituals, where did they come from? Arguably speaking, if you take an evolutionary perspective on that, human rituals must have come from animal rituals. And so he started to look very deeply at animal rituals. But interestingly, animal rituals are all mating rituals. So that was where we first started thinking about the sexuality piece. But as I started to work on this book, and as I, over time, as we had talked about this very intimate kind of relationship between rituals and the brain, and between sexual rituals and spiritual rituals, one of the ideas that has come about for us is, how did this evolve in the brain? And the idea is, some people have talked about religion evolving because it is adaptive. That's natural selection, that it gives us some advantage. It makes a more cohesive society. It helps us to control our environment or whatever. And I think that's true too. But there's two aspects of evolution. People don't always realize this, although a lot of times it kind of hits us in the face, which is that there's the natural selection, that's the survival of the fittest that everybody has kind of heard of. And we were just, as I was just talking about it, we have a bigger brain, so we can solve problems, we can create iron, we can, fertilize a field and irrigate a field, and we can create cities and so forth. So that's the natural selection piece of all of this. But sexual selection is a whole different thing. Sexual selection has to do with how we actually select our mates. And what's interesting about that, again, it kind of hits us in the face so often we don't even realize what's happening, but we see this all around us in the animal world. So this is why birds have big colorful feathers. The peacock has big colorful feathers. It's why, as I mentioned, I'm out in Colorado right now, and we have, the elk have these huge antlers, and the bigger the antlers, the more likely they are to mate. So these are not necessary for survival per se, but what they do is they signify to a potential mate, look at me, I'm a good potential mate. Now, what's interesting about that, when it gets into the discussion about rituals, is that, especially sexual rituals, is that how do we actually kind of meet people? Well, if you look at the animal world, they strut around, they flap their colors, they may sing, they may, make a calling or something like that. And there is this part of the ritual is the reciprocal interaction. So the male bird makes a call, and the female bird makes a reciprocal call, and then there's another call, and then there's a certain movement, and there's all these things. If you start to think about this in the context of humanity, while we don't necessarily have big ornaments, so to speak, in terms of antlers or big feathers, our ornaments actually have evolved into mental ornaments. And so when we sing to a potential mate, it's a song. We actually will come up with a melody, or we'll come up with a story or an idea, or even, more subtle things of humanity, like a sense of humor. And again, some of us we all have different senses of humor, and some of them are more subtle, and some of them are more obvious, and some of them are more raunchy, and some of them are, so who we wind up finding as a potential spouse, as a potential mate, depends on what they resonate with. And so if you have kind of a dry sense of humor, you're probably going to find someone who also has a dry sense of humor. And if you find someone who wants a different kind of sense of humor, it isn't going to go. And then this is where it ultimately kind of comes back to this discussion about sexuality and spirituality. So if all of this is kind of driven by the act of mating and sexual selection, then, what are the stories, the rituals, the music, the ideas that really kind of bring people together? And some have argued, and we support that argument, that religious and spiritual ideas and rituals and so forth may be an outstanding way of doing that, because when you're out there looking for a mate, the idea of this is what I believe, this is a story about how we can behave in the world, this connects us, this binds us. And so, we start to see this evolutionary process of the brain of the different rituals, of how we ultimately mate, which is the sexuality piece, and then how that all kind of comes together in some of the incredible creative aspects of humanity, of poetry and music and art and literature, and of course our ideas about religious and spiritual beliefs, how we have come to understand them and use that understanding to help us have a perspective on the world which is unique and maybe resonates with other people. Obviously religions resonate with arguably billions of people. Christianity and Islam each have a billion adherents. So it definitely is something that our brains, our minds really resonate with. And that's all part of that process that we were just talking about.
What's a common misconception about the relationship between religions and sex and sexuality?
Well, I think that, when we start, and I talk about this right away in the book, the kind of the obvious thing that many people realize is that sexuality generally is handled in some rather unusual ways when it comes to religion. And what's interesting is that it kind of cuts both ways. I mean, sometimes religion can embrace sexuality, and there are traditions that actually have said, gee, there's a lot of energy in sexuality. Maybe there are ways in which we can actually incorporate that energy and those perspectives into our sense of religiosity and spirituality. On the other hand, and part of what I wound up demonstrating in our brain scan studies for this book, is that there's a great deal of overlap between sexuality and spirituality. And of course, therefore, some religions can view the sexual piece as interfering, if you will, with the ability to connect with God. And so they will suggest celibacy or moving to a monastery and meditating and never really engaging in anything sexual. So, which is right and which is wrong? Well, I guess it depends on the particular tradition, but it is fascinating how traditions really take a great deal of interest in sexuality. It's not really a surprise because one, sexuality is fundamental to our existence, and two, there really is a lot of overlap there. But, one of the things that I often have been saying on some of these interviews and podcasts is that, even for people who are deeply religious, it's quite fascinating if you come at it from the Judeo-Christian perspective and you go to the Bible. The moment that human beings are created by God in the book of Genesis, what does God tell human beings to do? God does not tell us to pray. God does not tell us to build a church. God tells us to be fruitful and multiply. So basically, right out of the gate, God is telling us to be sexual and it recognizes the importance of that in continuing who we are, continuing our species. And many religious figures over time, including popes, have recognized that the love that people have for each other, the sexual love, really can be a very profound manifestation of the love that human beings can have for God and vice versa. This very, very intimate, deep, personal connection that connects us on every level, not just a kind of psychological level, but a physical, emotional, experiential level. With all of that being part of it, you can see why religion, spirituality, and sexuality really are very intimately linked. How they each decide to use it, I guess different traditions have different dietary perspectives, different practices, different ideas about prayer, different ways of leading their lives and so forth, different bases of morality. So again, kind of comes down to the uniqueness of our minds, our brains, that we see this in all the different traditions as well.
Tell our listeners, viewers, what is orgasmic meditation and how did you encounter this kind of spiritual practice?
So, over the years, I've been very fortunate to be able to study many different kinds of practices, pretty much from all the major traditions and many other traditions as well. We've studied Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. We've studied Sikhism. We've studied mediumship. We've studied Pentecostal Christian, speaking in tongues and so forth. A lot of times it kind of comes a little bit out of nowhere. I fortunately have been able to get a lot of our information out there and frequently just connect with someone reaches out to say, hey, we do this practice. Is this something of interest to you? Is this something that would help further some of your perspectives on the incredible relationship between the brain and spirituality? And that's exactly what happened here. I had not heard of orgasmic meditation. I was in my office. Our assistant said, there's a woman on the phone who has a meditation practice they want to talk to you about. And I said, oh, okay, sounds always happy to hear what they have to say. And she started to talk to me about this practice that they called orgasmic meditation, where basically it involves sexual stimulation. In particular, there's stimulation of the female clitoris that causes sexual stimulation, but it really forms for the people who are doing this, it forms the basis of a meditation practice. For the people who are listening, on one hand, I'm sure that sounds a bit odd, but many meditation practices do use different physiological processes. So we might focus our concentration on breathing. We might focus our concentration on walking. We might focus our concentration on the senses or pain or something like that. So the idea of potentially focusing our mind on a different sensory stimulus, in this case a sexual stimulus, is actually not that far-fetched, at least in terms of how other meditation practices go. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that we are talking about sexual stimulation, so there is a great deal of stimulation that occurs, and we know that sexual stimulation is one of the most arousing, most intense feelings that people can have. So as I'm listening to how this particular practice is performed, some of the other elements of it that made it very amenable to study is that it is very well prescribed in terms of how it's done. It is timed very specifically. That is very helpful for a researcher. Some of the early studies that we did of Buddhist meditation, I would say, well, how long do you need to meditate before you get into some of your peak types of states? And they say, well, we don't really know. We meditate for hours. Okay, it's a little hard to keep somebody in a scanner for hours. So to have a practice that is well timed, that that there are certain kind of stages of it, all of that facilitates the ability to study it. But also in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, went back to this early work that I did with my late mentor, where we were talking about, well, if there's rituals and the rituals in humans come from animals and those are mating rituals, there's got to be this connection between sexuality and spirituality. But we just didn't have a way of studying something like tantric yoga or something like that, which is maybe some of the more obvious perspectives on connecting sexuality and spirituality. I just didn't know people who were involved in those kinds of practices. But suddenly here was a group of people who all do the same kind of practice, do it the same kind of way, have very intense spiritual experiences. As I discussed with them, what do they feel and think? They sounded very much like spiritual experiences, feelings of oneness and connectedness, very intense feelings and so forth, that this sounded like a great opportunity to study something that might actually be a little bit of this missing link between understanding the relationship between sexuality and spirituality.
What's next for you? What research can you tell our listeners, viewers that you're...
Well, I'm actually very excited to continue exploring this relationship. You mentioned that there are many facets of this. One of them is the idea of where does sexual selection and natural selection come in. One of the other aspects of all of this, which has gotten a lot of attention over time, certainly atheists bring this up when they talk very negatively about religion, is that there's the negative side of religion and spirituality and the use of religion for abuses, for racism, for violence. And it's interesting there because sexuality has the same kind of issues as well. So, sexuality can be a wonderful thing between individuals who love each other and have an intimate connection, and it can be a wonderful expression of that connection. But unfortunately, sexuality can also lead towards violence and, and so forth. So I think that's one piece of all of this, which is to continue to look at the negative side of spirituality, the negative side of religion. It is important for us to look at, and as someone in the medical world, I'm always trying to understand when things go wrong, how we may help to quote unquote fix them, or at the very least redirect people into more positive ways of being. So I hope that these kinds of practices and the perspectives that we can learn help people find beneficial paths, positive paths that can lead them to better lives, better understanding of themselves, enlightenment, whatever different perspectives or goals that they have, and certainly better physical and mental health. One other areas that I'm very interested in, kind of in the context of some of the negative piece as well. Some of the more recent work I've done has looked not just at the overall areas of our brain that get affected, like areas like the frontal lobe that turn on when we concentrate, when we focus on a meditation, but the neurotransmitters, the chemicals, the dopamine and the serotonin and all that, which obviously are intimately related to the brain, intimately related to sexuality, very much so with spirituality. There's a a growing body of work being done on psychedelics, which also impact some of these different neurotransmitter systems in a very powerful way. So that's a whole other area of work. And perhaps the last area that I'm kind of moving into as well has been an exploration of specific traditions. And so I had an opportunity also with Turner to write a book called The Rabbi's Brain that looked at the relationship between Judaism and the brain and the field of neurotheology that all of this fits into. And since then, I have had an opportunity to write a book on Catholicism, and I'm working on books really trying to look at all the different traditions. So working on books on Islam, on Buddhism, Hinduism, other traditions. We're looking at African religions. So I think there's so much for us to learn as we explore what these traditions do, the different rituals, the practices, the experiences, the beliefs, and how that intersects with our brain and how our brain and our mind ultimately help us to engage these different traditions in similar ways as well as in different ways and in unique ways. And I hope that people from all these different traditions will have a lot to learn, and hopefully this field of neurotheology will bring us into a better understanding about how all of us as human beings really interact with the world around us and how we see the reality around us.
Dr. Andrew Newberg, he's author of the book Sex, God, and the Brain. Dr. Newberg, where can listeners find you online?
So they can find me on my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. And they can learn about Sex, God, and the Brain. They can learn about my other books and research articles and continue to follow the work that I do. And they can also follow me on Instagram. It's at Dr. Newberg, all one word, and they can continue to explore with me my contemplative pursuits as well, which is always part of this entire journey. And look forward to continuing to share all of this information with everyone out there. I think it's an exciting area for all of us to explore. We're all looking for the answers to who we are, and hopefully we'll find them together.
Dr. Newberg, thanks for joining us on Talk by Turner.
Thank you.
Talk by Turner, hosted by Jeffrey Colon. Watch and listen now wherever you enjoy podcasts.